So, good morning, everybody, dear participants, friends, and colleagues. Let me say it's a great pleasure to receive you both online and in the room that we have here today. My name is Hege Hoff. I'm responsible to oversee our work related to the EEA Agreement here in Brussels. And today I will give you a very brief introduction to the EEA Agreement, its scope, objective, and some principles. But before I do so, I would like to introduce you to the Secretariat. After all, you are here. So, as a matter of fact, we have three offices. The headquarters is in Geneva. You have already seen our Secretary General. That is where you find his offices. And that is also where you will find our colleagues that work with free trade agreements. That is all the agreements that our 4 member states enter into with countries outside the EU. Then we also have an office in Luxembourg, our statistical office. And as you know, we need statistics to do a good job. And finally, the EFTA Secretariat here in Brussels, where we are today, which by far is the largest part of the Secretariat. I do believe we are some 60 happy colleagues working in this fantastic building that we have recently moved into. And here we reside together with our sister organizations, the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the Financial Mechanism Office. And you will meet representatives from these organizations later on today. So, what is that we do in the EFTA Secretariat here in Brussels? Well, our core function, to put it very short, is to assist our member states in all their work related to the EEA agreement, what we call the EEA process. That is the work that takes place from an act has been proposed on the EU side and all the way into incorporation into the EEA agreement. And that is quite some process, and it takes a lot of work and support. And that is why what we call the EEA machinery. And you will learn a lot more about that later on today. We also have a very important role in coordinating work between our 3 EEA EFTA states. After all, we do need to agree before a decision can be taken. So we help them coordinate their work. Also, we coordinate work between the EFTA states and the EU side. And we are very happy to have a representative from the EU side, our counterpart in the Commission here later on today, who will give you his or the EU side's perspective on our work. Finally, we are also Secretariat to the EEA advisory bodies, that is the social partners, the parliamentarians, and also a forum for the regional authorities. And all this you will learn more about later today. So let's move on to the EEA agreement. What is the EEA agreement? Well, I'm sure you know by now that it is an agreement entered into by the EFTA states on one side, which is today are Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, and the EU on the other side. It entered into force in 1994. And the purpose is to establish a European economic area with common rules and equal conditions of competition, which in short means extending the internal market to the participating EEA EFTA states so that we have one common market with 30 member states and some 450 million people. That is quite something. And this agreement, there are two very important principles that govern this cooperation. The first is that the agreement is dynamic. What does that mean? Well, it means that it presupposes that all new legislation is supposed to be incorporated continuously into the EEA agreement. And of course, for that to take place, we need a decision-making system. The second very important principle that governs the EEA agreement is homogeneity. It means that, well, we have the same rules on paper, so to speak, but of course, we also need to apply, implement and apply and enforce the rules in the same way. That is what we mean by homogeneity. And for this to happen, we also need a institutional setup for surveillance and judicial control. That means the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court in Brussels. So this is the objective of the agreement and the principles. So let's look at what it takes to fulfill this in practice. Let's look at the scope of the EEA agreement, the rules therein. Well, at the core of the EEA agreement, we have the so-called four freedoms. That is what creates, that is the internal market, the core of it, where there shall be no unlawful restrictions on the free movement of goods, persons, capital, and services. And to make sure that this level playing field is not hampered by other forms of restrictive practices by companies or member states, we have other common rules. We have the competition rules, which prevents companies to agree on prices or to abuse a dominant position. We also have rules on state aid. Of course, a member state may grant state aid, for instance, now in COVID. That has been a very important tool, but it needs to take place in a certain manner. It needs to be lawful. Also, through the EEA agreement, there is a cooperation going beyond the core of the internal market, and that is what we call the horizontal policies. For instance, within the field of environment, social policy, consumer protection, very important, and statistics, which you will learn more about later today from our colleagues in Luxembourg. And finally, when it comes to the material scope of the EEA agreement, one very important aspect is EU program participation. Our member states participate in programs to a very large extent, be it in research and development, education, for instance. I see that we have quite a lot of young people attending today, which is great. And many of you might have benefited from the Erasmus exchange program, which also is due to the EEA agreement and our cooperation there. So this is the substantive scope of the EEA agreement. But as I said, the agreement is dynamic, and we need more than just the substantive scope. We need institutions and decisions to be taken. So now I will turn to the institutional setup of the EEA agreement. But before I do so, I think it is worthwhile to take a look at the background, to note the fact that EU and EFTA cooperation, that is two different models of cooperation. So I will just look at that, because that is important to understand why we have the institutional setup that we have in the agreement, and also why sometimes there are specific issues we need to address when we incorporate new legal acts. First, the EU model is built on supranationality, transfer of competence and sovereignty to the EU institutions, whereas in EFTA, the EFTA model is a traditional intergovernmental cooperation where we have not transferred competence or common policies, or we have common policies. And also in the EU model, we have institutions with defined roles in the decision-making process: the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council. The EFTA model is built on decisions being taken by consensus between the governments. And an important concern for the EU side is to preserve, of course, the decision-making autonomy of the EU, whereas on the EFTA side, the important concern has been to preserve the sovereignty of the EFTA states and their governments. And also on the EFTA side, we need to respect the constitutions of the member states. So, to reconcile these two different models of cooperation and at the same time fulfill the objectives and principles of the EEA Agreement, we ended up with this institutional model, also referred to as the two-pillar structure. And the reason we call it the two-pillar structure is that it reflects that EEA cooperation takes place in two different pillars. On the one side there, you will see the EFTA pillar with its institutions. And on the other side, we have the EU pillar with its institutions, and also the establishment of certain common bodies. I know this model, it looks quite daunting and intricate, and I will not go into detail. And actually also, you will meet people here, representatives here later on, who will give you a face to these boxes and also fill in with content. But it's important just to see the structure. And what is also striking that this is a very elaborate institutional model. You cannot find this model in any other agreement. So, just very briefly, the highest governing governing body on the political level is the EEA Council, where the parties meet on a political level twice a year to discuss the political development of the agreement. For the daily running of the EEA Agreement, the Joint Committee is the most important body, and that is where we come together to take decisions on incorporating new legislation into the EEA Agreement. And here, decisions are taken by unanimity. We, on the EFTA side, we speak with one voice, and the EU side, even there are 30 countries and the institutions, they also have one voice. And on the EFTA side, you see the Standing Committee. That is the highest governing body on the EFTA side. And that is where our member states come together and discuss and agree before they take decisions in the Joint Committee. And of course, they do a lot more. And we are very happy to have both representatives later on from the EU side to explain their perspective and how they see this work in these bodies, and also Liechtenstein's ambassador to the EU, which now holds the chair of the EFTA side in these bodies. So I will leave it at that, so you can wait in excitement till our colleagues explain more later on. Then, so this I would say is the part that caters for the dynamic part of the EEA Agreement. But we also need to safeguard homogeneity. We need to safeguard the fact that the rules are enforced and applied correctly. And here we have the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which then oversee the implementation, the enforcement of the EEA Agreement in the member states, and also that the companies respect the rules of the agreement. And if there is a disagreement between the member states and the EFTA Surveillance Authority, the cases can be brought before the EFTA court in Luxembourg to be resolved. and a representative from both these bodies will come later on today. But what I would like to say, what is special about this model then, where we have these two pillars, is that there is no transfer. The EEA agreement does not transfer competence from the member states towards the EU. The competence rests in the EU pillar, and it is for the institutions in the EU pillar to make sure that the EU side respects and apply the EEA agreement and their obligations. I think I will leave the structure as it is for now. Just note that the material scope of the EEA agreement and this institutional structure has remained unchanged ever since the entry into force of the EEA agreement. Whereas on the EU side, we have had treaty amendments and we have new ways, new areas of cooperation and new competences. And here I'm particularly thinking about the agencies, the development of agencies in all sectors of our society, and some of them also are very important in the internal markets. And some of these bodies, they have been given competence to adopt decisions that are binding towards member states or companies. And sometimes, and we have needed to find solutions that fit within this model. And sometimes that has been challenging. But what I can say is that we have always found solutions, and which is why we always like to say that the agreement has been robust and flexible. And with this, I leave you with a little image from when we marked the 25 years of the EEA agreement. In March 2019, you might say it's already history. Well, what I would say that it certainly represent well, the picture shows, let's just say that, it's our three prime ministers at that time and EU heads of state and government. They came together to mark the EEA agreement and the 25 years of cooperation. And I think it very nicely reflects the importance and the magnitude of the cooperation and the commitment that the contracting parties share to this cooperation. So with this, I thank you for your attention and I give the floor to my colleague Marit. Thank you.
Thank you, Hege. The questions.